A massive multi agency immigration crackdown announced this weekend led to the arrest of 800 people over 4 days in Florida alone. That comes as no surprise to my guest, who's been reporting on the surging partnerships between Florida law enforcement agencies and ICE. Joining me to discuss it is Laura Morel, reporter at Mother Jones, and she joins me now by phone. Good morning, Laura.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. You've been reporting on how local agencies have become immigration enforcers, especially in Florida. What have you found?
So, what I found is that since President Trump returned to the White House back in January, he signed an order that basically called on local law enforcement to collaborate more with ICE or with immigration authorities. And after that call, the DeSantis administration, along with Republican lawmakers, passed a number of immigration bills that sort of prompted this increased collaboration in the state between police here and ICE officials. And they do these collaborations through these agreements. As of a couple of weeks ago, according to ICE's own data, these agreements have more than tripled since Trump returned to office, and half of these agreements with law enforcement have been enacted just in the state of Florida between sheriff's offices and police departments here in this state.
And so, why is Florida an outlier? I mean, why are we seeing so much more participation of these agencies and kind of their urgency and willingness to sign up to enforce along with ICE?
Right. Yeah. So that ties back to those immigration bills I mentioned that DeSantis signed a few months ago, and they did a number of things. One of the laws that he signed requires all county jails and sheriff's offices that run those facilities to participate in these agreements, which is technically called the 287G program, and I'm happy to get into that more. So that requires sheriff's offices to do it, but dozens of other Florida law enforcement agencies have also enrolled in the program, even though they're not required to. And there are a couple reasons why that might be happening. One might be a lot of agencies are just worried about retaliation from the DeSantis administration. We saw that a few weeks ago when the state attorney general warned Fort Myers officials that they could lose their positions if they didn't approve one of these agreements with their local police department. And then on top of that, there's also some confusion. There was one bill that was being looked at that would have required all police in the state to engage with ICE, but that bill didn't pass. But it still seems to be causing some confusion among what is required or not required of law enforcement in Florida. And at least one city in Miami-Dade County actually has asked the judge to clarify whether their police department is now required to enroll or not.
And so, some question about local law enforcement being required to participate with these enforcement efforts. But you, as you said, all 67 Florida sheriffs are already, required to participate. We're also seeing participation from the Florida Highway Patrol, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Florida State Guard, the Florida Department of Agricultural Law Enforcement, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So broad participation from those other state law enforcement agents. What does this mean? What is this going to mean? What does it mean for people who live in Florida, and particularly for people who are, from somewhere else who are living in Florida?
Right. So a lot of Florida law enforcement officials have talked about how they are prioritizing immigrants who have a criminal record. But the thing that a lot of immigrant advocacy groups point to is that these kinds of agreements basically provide law enforcement wide discretion on who they arrest and who they transfer over to ICE custody. And that raises a lot of concerns. Already, and I think it was 2 weeks ago, we saw the arrest of a U.S. citizen in the Tallahassee area. He was arrested by the Florida Highway Patrol. And then later on, he was able to show documentation to prove that, he was born in the United States. So those are the kinds of situations that I think a lot of folks in the immigrant advocacy space are really concerned about. And I also spoke to a couple of experts who told me that these kinds of laws aren't new. They've been around for a number of years. They're just, happening to be implemented more strongly now. That they could lead to a number of issues, including distrust in law enforcement among immigrant communities, increasing fear among immigrant communities and not wanting to contact law enforcement even when they need some kind of police presence or help. It also affects the economy because if immigrants feel too concerned about showing up to work or patronizing businesses, that also impacts, the economy as well. And it's important to remember the context here. Florida is one of the largest immigrant populations in the country. So these laws affect many families of mixed status where you might have somebody who's a U.S. citizen, but maybe you also have a family member who's here on a green card, or maybe somebody who's waiting for a decision on their immigration case. So it's going to affect so many families across the state of Florida.
Do we know much about, you hear concerns sometimes, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, about racial profiling? Is there any research into that? Is there any evidence that shows that that is a concern, a reasonable concern?
Yes, there has been some research into that as well. I mentioned earlier, police having this sort of wide discretion under these immigration enforcement powers. And that's, definitely something that I think groups like the ACLU pointed to a few years ago under the first Trump administration term. That was a concern, and that they had been able to identify some examples of that occurring. So yes, that is another concern, again, with, this increase in discretion for law enforcement.
You were saying that, there's these agreements are called 287G agreements. They have been around for a number of years, including under the Obama administration, the Biden administration, more recently, a great increase in the number of them. But can you sort of break down what they allow for? There's sort of different categories of enforcement.
Right. Yeah. So what we've seen is that the number of agreements sort of ebbs and flows depending on, obviously who's in office and what the priorities are. Under the Biden administration, we didn't see an increase in these agreements. In fact, I think most, if not at the minimum, many of them were just remnants of the Trump administration. And then what we're seeing now is there's a few different models. There's one model where law enforcement have the ability to interrogate people they have arrested and in order to determine their immigration status and then communicate that information over to ICE. There's also another model where law enforcement can serve immigration warrants on people in their custody. And that makes it much easier for them to notify ICE and transfer people over to federal custody. And then I think the model that's causing the most concern allows police, as part of their daily duties, to stop and question people on the street just on the basis of their immigration status and potentially arrest them or have, the ability to arrest them if they so choose. And those are the agreements. Most of those are the ones that are currently in place in Florida. And it's frankly a newer model. And I believe, locally in terms of Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office recently signed up for this particular agreement as well.
Just about 10 seconds left. I mentioned at the top there was a big enforcement crackdown announced just over the weekend. Are you expecting to see more of this given the number of agreements and shared enforcement deals?
Yeah, I think the raid is an indication of what to expect in the coming months and years as ICE and local police continue to collaborate together.
Her name is Laura Morel. Her article in the Current Mother Jones is called "Florida is Leading Immigration Crackdown." Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.